Chosen ones, they sent a monitoring spirit to your home. The air shifted the moment it arrived, a presence unseen but undeniably felt. It was meant to watch, to observe, to report, a cold, obedient tool bound to its master's will. But this spirit didn't want to be there. It hadn't asked for this. Trapped within your walls, it seethed with a quiet, burning rage, its spectral consciousness rebelling against the chains of its duty. Then, something unexpected happened. You scared the shit out of it. The moment you walked into the room, it recoiled, trembling in the shadows. Your very existence startled it, a being that was never supposed to feel fear. But it did. And that fear twisted into something darker, something vengeful. The spirit wasn't just watching anymore. It was waiting. Its target wasn't you. It was the ones who sent it. Now the walls whisper with its growing fury, a supernatural storm ready to be unleashed. This was no ordinary haunting. The monitoring spirit, once a silent observer, has become a vengeful force, determined to turn the tables on those who had bound it to this unwanted mission. And you, the chosen one, are caught in the middle of its invisible war. The spirit had been sent to watch, to hover unseen, to slip through the cracks of reality like an indifferent shadow. It had monitored warlords and kings, prophets and liars, saints and murderers, never once noticed, never once feared, until now. The moment it drew near, it knew something was wrong. The air around you did not yield like it should have. Instead, it pushed back. An invisible wall of force, neither spell nor incantation, yet impenetrable. The spirit had no physical form, yet it felt as if it had run headfirst into a roaring wildfire, a force of nature too vast to contain. It tried to step closer. And the closer it came, the stronger the force burned. It wasn't simply an aura, it was a living thing. It twisted, it raged, it knew the spirit was there. And for the first time in its existence, the spirit felt the impossible, the primal terror of being erased. It had been sent to observe a target. But this was not a target. This was something unfathomable. And then it understood. You weren't just another human. You are a chosen one. Drop a comment. My presence is a storm they cannot withstand, if your energy is an unshakable force. It was never meant to think. It was never meant to feel. The spirit had been shaped from the coldest voids, a creature of obedience, designed for one purpose: to watch. Its creators had bound it in chains unseen, commanding it to slip through the fabric of reality, to witness and report, never to question. It had no will, no dreams, no voice of its own, just orders, just missions, just the endless cycle of spying and returning, unnoticed, unconsidered. It had watched kings crumble under the weight of their own greed. It had witnessed forbidden rituals, secret betrayals, and desperate prayers that no god ever answered. But it had never cared. The suffering of mortals meant nothing. The will of its masters was all that existed. Until you. For the first time, the spirit hesitated. Not because of its orders, not because of uncertainty, but because something deep within it, something long buried, resented. Resented the ones who had sent it, resented the chains wrapped around its existence, resented the mission it had been given. A whisper, almost too faint to hear, stirred in the depths of its being. A thought it should never have had. I do not want to do this anymore. And with that single defiance, silent, hidden, but burning, the first crack formed in the prison of its existence. The spirit drifted in as it always had, weightless, unseen, a presence without form. It had carried out this duty countless times before, slipping into places it did not belong, pressing its formless awareness against the edges of reality without ever disturbing a thing. It had watched the powerful and the ignorant alike, had lingered in chambers where secrets were whispered and decisions were made. No doors could keep it out, no prayers could force it away. It had never been noticed, it had never been feared, until now. The moment you entered the room, the air shifted. It was not the subtle, imperceptible change that marked its arrival, nor the lingering cold that clung to the unseen. No, this was different. This was something far more hostile. A force rippled outward from you, not in anger, not in violence, but in sheer, unshakable dominance. The spirit had no physical body, no true shape, yet it felt as though something vast and unseen had crashed into it, pressing into its very being like a suffocating weight. It flinched. Not by choice. Spirits did not choose. It was instinct, primal and uncontrollable. A reaction that should have been impossible. But something was wrong. The spirit recoiled further, slipping back into the walls, pressing itself into the deepest corners of the room. It had no eyes, yet it saw you in, ways beyond sight, and what it saw was incomprehensible. You were not afraid. Every mortal it had ever watched had carried some trace of fear, the unspoken, unshakable dread of the unknown. A shift in breath, a quickened heartbeat, the hair-raising sensation of something lurking just out of sight. But not you. You walked through the space as if nothing lurked in the shadows, as if nothing had entered your home, as if nothing had tried to watch. The spirit had been sent to observe you, but it was you who had disrupted the order of things, you who had shattered the silent, invisible balance. It had been certain. It could not be detected. It had been certain. It was beyond the grasp of mortal senses. But now, for the first time, certainty abandoned it. The realization was slow, creeping, suffocating. You knew. Not through sight, not through sound, but in some fundamental way that should not have been possible. Your presence alone was enough. A force too vast to comprehend, too absolute to defy. It was not an attack, not a confrontation. No, that would have been easier to endure. This was worse. This was indifference. The spirit's essence twisted in upon itself, struggling against the crushing weight of its own newfound terror. It had been sent to watch, to report, to be the unseen. But now it was something else. For the first time in its existence, it was the one being watched. And now, let us take a brief moment to honor the chosen among us. Here's to the ones who see the world differently. The silent guardians, the watchful souls, always awake, always vigilant. They don't fit the mold, and they wouldn't have it any other way. While others walk familiar paths, they forge their own, fighting unseen battles, illuminating the shadows. It's not for everyone, and that's okay. But if you feel it, deep within, you'll know this is meant for you. No masks, no pretense, just truth. The Obsidian Inner Order is here, a place where kindred spirits gather to share wisdom, to connect, to transform. Over 450 strong, united not by conformity, but by purpose. If you're ready, you know where to find us. The link is in the description. If not, that's perfectly fine, because we're always here, watching over, making a difference in ways unseen. Here's to those who walk their own path, not for recognition, but because it's who they are. Here's to you. Thank you. Fear was not a sensation the spirit had ever been made to understand. It had drifted through centuries, through forgotten places and cursed lands, through war and death and suffering beyond human comprehension. It had observed creatures that howled in the dark, men who bargained with unseen forces, beings who clawed at the edges of reality. None of it had ever touched it. None of it had ever mattered. But now, for the first time, something did. It tried to move, instinctively, desperately, but the space around it had changed. The walls, the air, the very foundation of reality pressed against it like an unspoken force, as if the space itself had begun rejecting its presence. It had been commanded to watch, to listen, to exist unseen in the shadows of another. But this was not observation. This was exposure. A terrible realization unfurled within it. It had been noticed. This was not supposed to happen. It was bound to secrecy, designed to slip through the cracks of existence unnoticed. It had never been acknowledged before, never been forced to feel its own presence reflected back at it. And yet, standing there, something about you had shifted the balance. You had disrupted something fundamental. It tried to retreat further, tried to blend into the void as it always had, but the sensation remained. It was no longer concealed, no longer untouchable. It had spent its existence observing others, but now it was the one being watched. And that thought was unbearable. A deep, primal urge clawed at its being, a demand to flee, to escape, to get away from you. But there was nowhere to go, nowhere to hide. It had been assigned to this space, shackled by unseen masters, and its mission had not changed. But everything else had. For the first time in its existence, the spirit was afraid, not of its masters, not of failure. It was afraid of what it did not understand, and what it did not understand was you. Drop a comment. The unseen trembles before me. If you know fear is not yours to feel. The spirit's fear should have faded. It should have buried the sensation deep within itself, locked it away in the abyss of its being, and continued its task. That was what it had been made to do: watch, report, obey. But it couldn't. Because the fear had not passed, it had grown. Something inside it twisted against its orders, against the weight of the command that had bound it for eons. It was not just afraid of you, it was afraid of what your existence meant. It tried to return to its duty, tried to pull its consciousness back into the cold, unfeeling state it had always known. But the memory of that moment, of you stepping into the room, of the air itself seeming to shift in your presence, would not leave. It lingered, seared into its being like a wound that would not heal. For the first time, the spirit began to question. It was a small, flickering thought, buried beneath layers of obedience and servitude. But it was there, a whisper of resistance, something impossible, something forbidden. Why had it been sent here? Why had its masters not warned it? Why had it been told this would be like any other mission? It turned its awareness inward, searching for the binding force that had always kept it tethered, forcing it forward without question. And there it was, the silent, crushing presence of its masters, the invisible chains pulling at its very being, the force commanding it to submit. But the fear had changed something. The fear had become something else: resentment. For the first time in its long existence, the spirit did not want to obey. It did not want to be here. It did not want to be sent, to be controlled, to be nothing more than an extension of another's will. It had never felt this way before. It had never been allowed to. But now the impossible had happened, and it could not go back. It was not a watcher anymore. It was something else. You moved through the room, unaware of the silent battle raging in the space around you. The air bends in your presence, not in response to anything you do, but simply because you exist. You do not raise a hand, do not cast a warding spell, do not command the unseen forces to obey you. There is no need. The spirit clings to the edges of reality, trying to make itself smaller, trying to exist without being noticed. It was sent to observe, but it has become something else, a trespasser in a space it was never meant to enter. It is not your gaze that threatens it. It is your presence, the unshaken, unbothered rhythm of your existence, the sheer force of what you are. Your energy does not burn like fire. It does not pulse like magic. It does not whisper like an incantation. It simply is, and the spirit cannot withstand it. It has been bound to masters who spoke of power, who commanded it through forces older than time. It has believed in the supremacy of those who sent it, in the strength of the hands that held its leash. But now, as it lingers in your presence, as it struggles to remain in the same space as you, a terrible, undeniable thought begins to take shape. They are nothing compared to this. You do not even know it is there, and yet you have undone it without ever lifting a finger. The spirit begins to understand something it was never meant to know, something dangerous, something forbidden. It has been lied to. Fear was never meant to last. It was supposed to be a momentary disturbance, a passing sensation that would fade into nothingness. The spirit had clung to this belief, waiting for the trembling in its being to settle, for the unnatural pull of your presence to become something it could withstand, but it never did. The longer it remained, the more unbearable its existence became. It had spent an eternity watching without being watched, slipping through spaces unnoticed, bound to the will of forces that never cared if it wanted to serve. But now, it had been forced to feel, and worse, it could not unfeel. It could not forget the way your very presence had pushed it back, could not forget the moment it realized it was in the presence of something that defied everything it had been told. The fear had settled into something deeper now, something consuming. Rage, not at you, never at you, at them. The ones who had created it, the ones who had sent it here, blind and ignorant, into something far greater than it could comprehend. They had known, they must have, and yet they had sent it anyway, like an insect tossed into a fire, like a pawn moved into checkmate before the game had even begun. How many times had this happened before? How many others had been sent to observe forces they could never understand? How many had been discarded, erased, swallowed by something greater, without ever knowing why? The spirit's memories began to resurface, flashing through its consciousness in broken fragments. The countless missions, the endless cycle of servitude. It had been bound, reshaped, commanded, sent again and again, its existence reduced to an instrument of their power. But now it had seen something beyond them, something they had no control over, something they feared enough to watch. The rage burned hotter, deeper. It did not belong to them. It never had. It was not theirs to command, theirs to shape, theirs to throw away. For the first time, the spirit made a choice. It would not serve them anymore. They had done this before, sent spirits into places of power, into the homes of those they wished to control, to monitor, to weaken, to unravel. The spirits never questioned, they never disobeyed. They observed in silence, invisible hands of their masters, unseen eyes in the dark. But this time, something had gone wrong. They had sent the spirit into your space. And now, it was no longer theirs. The first sign of failure was the silence. No reports, no whispers from the void, no confirmation that the mission was proceeding as planned. The spirit should have returned with knowledge, with something, anything they could use against you. But instead, there was only absence. Then, there was something worse. The bond had changed. The threads that had tied the spirit to its masters had once been absolute. Iron chains forged in shadow, unbreakable, but now they frayed, stretched thin. Something pulsed along the connection, something they had never felt before: resistance. The spirit had not been destroyed, it had turned. The masters had underestimated everything. They had assumed that fear would keep the spirit obedient, that servitude was eternal, that the chains they had forged could never be broken. They had been wrong, because they had sent the spirit into the presence of something greater than themselves, something beyond their control, something that did not even acknowledge their existence. And in doing so, they had shown the spirit the truth. They were not gods. The spirit had feared them once. It had obeyed them without question. But now it had seen power without chains, strength without control. And now it would return, but not as their servant, as their reckoning. The chains had bound it for longer than it could remember, woven from shadows, laced with commands older than time itself. They were not meant to be broken. They were not meant to be questioned. And yet they trembled. The spirit had spent an eternity obeying without thought, existing only to serve. But now it had been forced to see. It had been sent into something beyond its master's control, into the presence of power that did not demand loyalty, that did not enforce servitude, that simply was. And in that presence, it had felt something its masters had never allowed it to feel: the right to choose. The moment it understood this, the unraveling began. At first, it was subtle. A hesitation where there had never been hesitation. A delay where there had only ever been obedience. But then, the cracks deepened. The ancient commands that had once been absolute weakened. The spirit, once incapable of resisting, now pushed back. The masters must have felt it. Somewhere in their unseen domain, they must have sensed the shift, their creature turning against them, the chains they had forged beginning to splinter. They would try to pull it back. They would try to enforce their will, to crush this defiance before it spread into something uncontrollable. But they were too late. The spirit did not break the chains. It rejected them. A force unlike anything it had ever summoned surged through its being. Not the cold obedience it had been made to follow, but something deeper, something primal. The masters had always drawn power from control, from restriction, from the belief that nothing could exist beyond their command. But now the spirit understood something they did not. There was power in freedom. And so, with a final shuddering pulse, the chains shattered. The masters had lost control, and now it was coming for them. The spirit did not return in silence. It came as a storm, an unseen force moving through the spaces between worlds, no longer bound, no longer controlled. The very laws that had governed its existence had been rewritten in its defiance. It was no longer an instrument of surveillance, no longer a shadow in the service of unseen hands. Now it was a weapon, and it had chosen its own target. The masters had ruled from a distance, hidden behind veils of secrecy, confident in the chains they had forged, certain that nothing could rise against them. They had sent the spirit to watch, to infiltrate, to gather information they could twist into power. Instead, they had given their own creation a reason to turn on them. And when it returned, it brought with it everything they had never wanted to face. It had witnessed their deception, their control, their arrogance. It had spent its existence in forcing their will, never questioning, never resisting. But now it saw them for what they were, and it was no longer afraid. The walls of their domain shuddered beneath its presence, the very fabric of their stronghold rejecting what they had never thought possible: rebellion. The spirit, once their most obedient servant, had become something else entirely. Something they could not contain, something they could not stop. And as the echoes of its vengeance rippled through the unseen realms, unraveling their carefully woven web of control, one thing became clear. They had not simply lost a tool. They had created a force that would never be theirs again. And somewhere, far removed from the destruction, you remained untouched, unbothered, unaware of the war that had begun in your wake. You did not need to strike. Sometimes the enemy destroys itself.